My name is Becca. My last name is Heller-Steinberg. And my pronouns are she, her. I am an herbalist. My day job is in organic certification, but I really love to go out and walk just around my neighborhood in the woods, play with plants, harvest plants, grow plants, make plants into medicine. Dan does more cooking in our house than I do, but I also cook and preserve foods. So I love plants and food in general. I got started learning about herbalism and using wild plants for food when I was a kid with my mom, who's actually on this Zoom call. And just, picking things like dandelions out of the lawn and using them in salads. I think that was one of the ways that we got started. Picking plantain, putting it up, chewing it up, and putting it on bug bites. Those are actually two plants we'll look at and talk about in the workshop. I will use botanical names when I talk about plants in addition to the common names. That's for a couple of reasons. One is that the common names of plants can vary from place to place. So using the botanical, sometimes called Latin names, the binomial nomenclature, the genus and species, can help us to be more specific and know what other people are talking about when it comes to plants. They also can be a little intimidating. So if you're not into it and you don't know them, that's totally fine. Just ignore that part. But I do throw them in there because I know some people like to know them and learn them. And also, once we start to learn those names, as well as the families that plants are in, we can start to see how different plants are connected to each other and connected within families and how they might have similar properties, both in terms of how they're used and also so that we can be better at identifying them, because things in the same family might have some of the same identifying characteristics. So I will throw those in there, but if they're not useful to you, just ignore them, please. I am an herbalist. I've been using herbs to treat myself and friends and family for various health issues for many years, but I am not a licensed medical professional. So obviously, please, before using plants for health conditions, you want to do your own research. And if you have any major medical issues around medications, things like that, you should definitely consult with a doctor or medical professional before you do that. Also, if you're pregnant or breastfeeding, those are other things to keep in mind. Let's see. Why should we harvest weeds and use them? If we were in person, we might talk about this a little more, but I'll just tell you why I think it's really great to use them. And then maybe you have some of your own reasons, and you could feel free to share them in the chat box if you want. So one of the biggest reasons right now is with what's been going on with coronavirus. A lot of folks have less money available, right? We're trying to kind of stretch limited or no income. We're also trying to go out less, right? So we might have less fresh food in our house and more just kind of pantry items, but we really want to be healthy. We want our immune systems to be in good shape. We want to be able to resist various kinds of health challenges that might come up. So I think for me, those are all factors in wanting to utilize weeds, right? So they can cut down on our food budget. They are, for the most part, free, but obviously it is, not everybody has the time and energy and other resources to harvest them. So in some ways it is a privilege to be able to harvest wild plants, but it's not going to cost you money. So that's great. Yeah, it can help us to improve our diets through increasing the variety in our diet. And a lot of wild plants are very high in a variety of nutrients and minerals. And so we can improve the nutrition of our diet by incorporating them into what we're already eating. And also, if you're just eating the same pantry foods over and over again, rice and beans is delicious, but sometimes it can get a little repetitive if we're eating it a lot. So maybe throw in some wild greens in with your rice and beans, or your pasta, something like that. So those are a few reasons. Let's see.
Becca, do we want to ask our audience what reasons they are here for? Shall I send out the poll?
Sure, let's do that now.
Right. Guys, this is your chance to participate and share your story. If you want to add more details, add them in the chat box. Otherwise, complete the poll. Question 1. Have you harvested or eaten wild weeds or wild plants? Question 2. Where do you intend to harvest wild weeds or wild plants? Urban or suburban backyard, public park, private wooded area, garden, or other? Question 3. Have you used weeds or wild plants medicinally? And question 4. What area are you most interested in learning about? Medicinal uses of plants, food uses of plants, ethical wild harvesting and relationship with the land, or preservation and preparation of wild food and medicine? So 38% of our participants have voted. 53% have voted. 61% have voted. Oh, the turnout is getting better and better.
And I can't see this at all, so I like that you're reading it aloud.
The chat section is saying number 4 is too hard to choose. You know what? That last one I didn't get to do multiple choice. That's my mistake.
It's okay. You don't have to choose one if you don't want to.
I have a feeling that she wants to choose them all. That's just a guess. All right, 10 more seconds. And we're ending the poll now, and I'm going to share the results with the group. So 63% of us have harvested or eaten wild foods before. So I'm really curious to hear what people have experienced so far. 63% of us are going to be harvesting wild foods from a suburban or urban backyard, 13% from a public park, 63% from a private wooded area, 38% from a garden, and 13% from other. I wonder what that other might be. Have you used weeds or wild plants medicinally? 38% say yes, 63% say no. And what are you most interested in learning about? 50% want to learn about the medicinal uses of plants. 25% want to learn about the food uses of plants. 13% want to learn about ethical wild harvesting and relationship with the land. And 13% want to learn about the preservation and preparation of wild foods and medicines.
All right. Well, thank you all for participating in those. I should mention there is a very long handout. I apologize a little bit for the length, but I just wasn't sure, with the technology, how much information you all would be able to get, and I wanted you to get a ton of information. So again, as with the botanical names, take whatever's useful to you and just ignore the rest. But I will mention that in the handout there are a number of recipes, and I tried to include some recipes that could be used with a variety of plants, not just one specific plant. And I also included a long list of resources, both books, because I am a book person, as well as online, because I know not everybody is a book person. And some of those links have more information about both edible and medicinal uses of wild plants, There's some on plant identification, which obviously is important when you're harvesting wild plants. Yeah, there's a ton of information. So as well as my email address. So if you do have any questions that come up that were not answered and want to know like where to get more information, you can absolutely feel free to email me and I can try to share more resources as well. So there's more like little detail thingies to talk about, but I want to walk around and show you plants and we can discuss some of the other details later, including sort of more of the ethics and how to harvest. But the neat thing is, so right now I'm in our yard. We are in the city of Binghamton. We're pretty lucky to have a pretty large yard. It's kind of like 3 lots. So it's almost 1/4 of an acre. So it's a large lot for being in the city limits. But even if you don't have this much space, and even if you don't have your own land to harvest on, there are lots of opportunities to pick weeds and wild plants throughout the city and the surrounding area. So right here from where we were sitting, I'm seeing like 4 or 5, maybe more plants that can be used for food and medicine. So let's start. I'm just going to grab my basket and my peppers. So here we go. Probably some of you recognize this plant. Just let you get a look at it. So some people call this bamboo. It looks a lot like bamboo in that it has these hollow stalks. I don't know if you can see that, but they're hollow in the middle, and then they have these nodes or knees all the way down, and they have a leaf coming out at each node, and they get huge. So these are not bamboo, even though they look a lot like it. They are Japanese knotweed. And actually, I can't even tell you the botanical name of this off the top of my head because, oh, it's Rainutria now, I think. There's at least 3 botanical names. So that's one of the drawbacks of botanical names, is that sometimes as more information is found about how the plants are or are not related to other plants, then the botanical name is changed. So you'll see in the handout, I listed both the current botanical name and a couple of the past botanical. We're over here because there's also these huge stalks from last year's knotweed, which is one way that you can recognize it. So it has, look, this is not atypical. I'm 5 feet tall, and this is probably at least 7 feet tall. Yeah, so it can get pretty huge. Japanese knotweed is definitely an invasive. There's some information in your handout about invasive species. But basically, when I talk about invasives, I'm talking about plants that really outcompete most other plants and decrease the biological diversity of the area. Which is not to say that they're all negative. They do have flowers that a lot of pollinators really like. So sometimes when you get like the fall honey, or sometimes they will call it like bamboo honey around this area, that's a lot of that is from Japanese knotweed flowers. But this has a sour taste to it, a lot like rhubarb, which I believe it is related to. And people both eat it and use it medicinally. So this is like the height that these are right now, which is like about this high in this range, is taller than most people harvest knotweed. We're a little late on our knotweed harvest window. Generally, you want to harvest it when it's little, maybe like 8 to 10, 12 inches max. But it's possible to continue harvesting it later in the season and just harvest the top several inches. And the issue is more that it gets tough as opposed to that anything in particular changes with the flavor or the nutritional content. And as it gets older and tougher, you might want to peel this before you use it. It's also high in oxalic acid, which is not good for folks with certain medical conditions. But the oxalic acid is basically deactivated by cooking. So if you cook it, it should be safe for consumption, even if you're concerned about oxalic acid levels. But obviously, you know, if you do have a medical condition where that's an issue, just double check with your doctor. So these shoots with that sour flavor are used in both sweet and savory cooking. There's more info in your handout, but one of the uses I've heard is sort of an invasive plant sorbet with this pureed, so it gets that nice, you get that nice sour flavor like rhubarb, and then combined with a fruit or flower. You could do like wild rose petal and knotweed sorbet. That would be delicious. I've heard of autumn olive, which is a fall fruit, so you'd probably have to freeze this. So then you could wait until the autumn olives were ready and pair them up. And the root of this is used medicinally for a bunch of different things. But one of the major things that it's used for in this area is as part of a protocol for Lyme disease. So Lyme disease is very difficult to treat, both with conventional medicine and with herbal medicine. So it's usually not just like a one plant treatment, but Japanese knotweed is used a lot as part of a treatment protocol with other plants. You can look into that more. Stephen Herod Buhner, who I didn't list his Healing Lyme book in the resource section, but one of his other books is listed, The Lost Language of Plants. So that's a great resource.
Name, Becca?
Buhner, Buhner. But it's, yeah, if you look in the book section, The Lost Language of Plants is also by him, which I did recommend. Yeah, so this can be eaten raw, but I recommend cooking it. It can also be used in savory stuff. People pickle it or just chop it up and put it in like stir fries and soups and stuff. Let's talk about those other plants that were right nearby. So this area is pretty clear because it just got mowed. So sometimes a good time to harvest is right before an area gets mowed because obviously there's more growth available. Here we have some violets. This is the violet leaf, which I think of as heart-shaped. And yeah, they're pretty, some of them are like a little more, they're still all heart-shaped. There's a little variation in leaf shape. And then there are a few different colors of violet flowers. I think we're really lucky to have these beautiful white ones with the purple in the middle. I love them. I see the purple flowers more often, which we also have. That's right here. And these are related to Johnny Jump Ups, which you might have seen in a garden. And Johnny Jump Up flowers, in addition to these violet flowers, are edible. That's definitely something that I learned from my mom growing up. She would put those Johnny Jump Up flowers on salads and things like that. I've seen also beautiful spring rolls made with edible flowers in them. These have, I would say, a mildly sweet taste. The flowers are mostly just fun to eat. I think the leaves are going to be a bigger source of nutrition. So the leaves can be eaten or cooked or put into things like pestos, and they are just very nutritious. Yeah, I think that's just a pretty simple edible. I think people do use violet medicinally, but I don't really, and I don't think it has a particularly strong medicinal action. But certainly check, if you're interested in using it that way, you could check out other resources. We could stay right here and do more. Okay. probably most of you recognize this with these seeds that blow away and these nice toothy leaves with this reddish midvein and a pretty milky sap. And that is dandelion. Most of our dandelion flowers are gone by now, but there's a few scattered around. I see one over there. Most have already gone to seed like this. So the dandelion is great. I wouldn't eat those puffy seeds, probably a little gross in texture. But basically every other part of the dandelion is great to use. So the leaves are edible. Dan snagged on the thing. The leaves are edible. They get bitter as the season goes on. So if you want to eat them on their own, I recommend eating them pretty much in early spring before they've started to put up a flower stalk. Well, yeah, at this point they're pretty darn bitter. But those bitter flavors are good for us and can signal powerful medicine. And one of the ways that this plant is used is as a support for the liver. And it has sort of a pretty extensive history of being used that way. And both the leaves and the root are used medicinally to support the liver. And also that bitter flavor is great for our digestion. So when we eat a bitter flavor, when a bitter flavor hits our tongue, it starts to stimulate the whole digestive tract. So it stimulates saliva production in the mouth, and it stimulates our digestive juices to start flowing. And it basically just gets everything ready for digestion. So especially for folks who have any kind of indigestion, either sluggish digestion, or even in some cases heartburn, I recommend eating bitters or using bitters in another form, maybe like 15-20 minutes before a meal to really get your digestion going. And then seeing if that helps. It can also be taken when you have like gas or indigestion, but I think it's most effective when taken before meals. The leaves are a bit of a diuretic, so use caution with that, but that's in more concentrated quantities and sort of more medicinal quantities. Generally not too much if just, mixing a bit in with another food. And I have not done this, but people use, this stem's a little dried out. Maybe when we find one with a fresh flower, the stems have sort of a milky sap, and people use that to treat warts. The flower petals are used in, like, people make like dandelion wine and dandelion mead. People take the fritters or the flower petals and make them into like fritters they like batter them and fry them. They use them decoratively on various foods and desserts. There's a lot of uses for dandelion, and they're so common, right? So this is a very widely available food and medicine, and I love it. And I feel like when the flowers, I know people hate it in their lawn, but I feel like when those sunny yellow flowers come up in the spring, it's just so joyful to see them. And especially in this area, which can sometimes have winters that drag out quite a bit, I feel like it's just such good medicine to see them welcoming the warmer weather. So let's see, what else have we got? We've got one lonely dandelion over here that's still in bloom. So I'm not going to pick it. We'll leave it for those pollinators. But let's see. Oh, and I don't see any, we're late on these, but you can also use the flower buds of the dandelion. Those are edible as well, and people sometimes pickle them to make sort of a keeper-like food. see. A couple other things I'd like to talk about up here. Actually, do you guys want to just type into the chat box, like, are you able to see and hear what I'm talking about and showing you? Is this working so far, or is anything not working? I'll maybe just give you a minute to type that in, and Christina could let me know.
People are saying yes, loud and clear. You're great.
Okay.
Yes,
Awesome.
great.
Cool.
The only thing I know, Becca, is that there's a bit of a video lag on Facebook, and we don't know what to do about that, but they can still hear you and they still see you. It's just a little delayed.
That's okay. Yeah. There's not really much we can do here, so about that. All right. This one is definitely anher invasive. I don't think I would call dandelion an invasive, but it's very common. This, some of you might recognize this, is garlic mustard. Here's one with the flowers. So we're almost past the flowering stage. We might see as we walk around if we can find one with more flowers left. But these little green things are where there were flowers. Those are now the seed pods. And so it has these white 4-petaled flowers, very small, and a bunch of them. So there were a bunch more here where the seed pods are. And its botanical name is Alaria petiolata. It is in the Brassica or mustard family, and shares a lot of traits with other things in that family. There's a lot of edibles in that family, a lot of your plants that you grow in your garden. So, you know, like kale, broccoli, cauliflower, there's a lot. Cabbage. Well, I said cabbage family, or did I say mustard family? People call it both. And yeah, so I could list a lot more mustard family plants, but I don't want to get too distracted. So this family is really, I think, pretty easy to identify. So it's got those 4 petals in the flowers. It's hard to see in these because these flowers are older and these flowers are quite small. But if you find something in this family with a larger flower, you'll see that it has 6 stamen in the flower, which are the so-called male reproductive parts. And it has this like weird pattern where like 4 of them are one length and 2 are another length. I can't remember if it's 4 long and 2 short, or 2 long and 4 short at the moment. And then it has these alternate leaves. So instead of the leaves growing across the stem from each other, which would be called opposite, they alternate up the stem. So that is another one of the identifying traits. This particular plant also has kind of a garlicky smell to it. If you take a leaf and crush it in your hand, I definitely experience it as a garlicky type smell. And interestingly, if you look at the leaves, you can see these are shaped a little bit like those violet leaves, right? It's definitely heart-shaped like. This one doesn't have quite as much of a dip at the top, but some of them do. So sometimes when they're smaller, it can be a little bit hard to tell the difference until you really get used to them. This plant is a biennial, so that means it takes 2 years to produce seed, and it looks different in its first year than its second year. So these are second year plants that are growing right here that are producing seeds. And I'll show you in a sec the first year plant. But this is an invasive plant that chokes out other vegetation. It even produces chemicals that sort of knock out or like discourage some of the other plants from growing. So this is one where we definitely want to harvest it and use it because it's detrimental to some of the other plants that we might want to grow. Actually, right here where we are, you can see this is the first year vegetation. So these will get bigger than this, but they grow in what's called a basal rosette, which is sort of basically like all the leaves coming off the stem right around ground level. Whereas the second year plant obviously is nothing like that. It puts up this big shoot with leaves going all up the stem. So look out for them in both stages if you're trying to reduce the population of it in your yard or garden. You definitely want to try to get it before it goes to seed, which is what's happening now. We've ripped out a bunch here, but there's still a ton of it left. But it is edible. So you can eat the flowers, the seed pods, the leaves, and the roots. The roots, I think, are my favorite. They're kind of mildly spicy, a little bit like horseradish. They have sort of like a garlicky, mustardy flavor. And you can, preserve them by shredding them really fine and adding some salt and vinegar, just like with horseradish. The roots can get tough though, so I usually use sort of, as I chop them up, I kind of test them to see if they're like too woody. And the tougher ones, you could infuse in vinegar to make a flavored vinegar, but you probably wouldn't want to try to eat them like horseradish. What else? Oh, yes. It's important to know that this plant is a bit bitter. Some people eat it and don't really notice the bitterness too much. Some people find it super bitter. I find that this is kind of an individual preference thing. But I definitely would be remiss if I did not mention the bitterness. And also that the bitterness varies depending on the stage of the plant, whether it's the basal rosette or the second year plant, and the time of year. But it's there. I would say it's there all the time. It's just stronger some of the time. I think it gets more bitter in hotter weather. So even if you don't love the bitter, you can definitely use this in food by just combining it with other greens. So I like to, sort of blanch it or steam it, chop it up, and put it in with other greens, with eggs. I've thrown it in soup. And this year, when we had our Passover Seder and we didn't have horseradish and didn't want to go to the store an extra trip, we used the root as a horseradish substitute. So a lot of good uses there, and you're doing good for the environment by harvesting it and ripping it out. Oh, no, there's another one right here I want to show you. Almost ran away from a good spot. So this is another one that's considered an invasive. Some of you might think this looks familiar from your garden, and you would be right. This is a variety of wild rose. So looks very similar to cultivated rose. You can see. So this is the newer growth. So there's not really spines on this stalk. There's like little ones on the leaf stalk, the petioles. That sort of catches on my finger. But the big thorns are on the inner stalk. Let's see if we can find one. I definitely have felt them on this plant before. Oh, here's one. Oh, and I touched another one on the other side. So got those nice thorns. So if you're harvesting these, or even if you're harvesting around them, be cautious, because some sections of the stem might seem bare, and then there's like, a clump of those very sharp thorns, which you don't want to get torn up on. But so one of the things that's used on this plant is the rose hip, which is actually the fruit. So that would come after they flower. So this is from last year. It's very dried out. Normally they would be sort of like a reddish color. And rose tips are extremely high in vitamin C and are used in tea and a variety of other preparations. They're also a bit astringent. But I also like to use the flowers of the plant as medicine or in food. So the petals, also like cultivated rose petals, can be used in jam or for medicinal purposes. You could tincture them in alcohol or glycerin. And rose is so this is an area of herbal medicine that I feel like I've explored a bit less, but I think it's an important area. So people use rose sort of as something that can be calming and uplifting, and people also use it sometimes for grief. And there are a lot of herbal medicines that are used that way. You know, it's not like an antidepressant where it's going to take away your sadness, although obviously that's a whole other conversation about how antidepressants don't always work and there can be lots of side effects. But basically, sometimes these plants can just be aids to support us a little bit in working through various emotions as well as more physical health issues. So I think that, as I said, that's not an area of herbal medicine that I have used as much, but I work with other herbalists who have a lot, and people love rose. I think that's another piece of it, is that if you combine it with other medicines, it has this like very comforting, familiar feel to a lot of people, which can be important when you're taking herbs. You don't want something to just feel totally unfamiliar, bitter, gross, which some herbs have. To add flavors that feel familiar and comforting to people is a really important aspect of it, even if it's not having this super direct effect on the physical body. Let's talk about wild cherry. This is one of my favorites. So a lot of the plants that we're talking about are herbaceous plants, right? So plants that die back to the ground every winter and then either come back from the root or come back from seeds the next year. And those, when they're weedy, are great to harvest without really doing harm. Trees are a little different, and when we talk about ethical harvesting, I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. We'll talk about best practices for trees, but they're a little different. So this tree right here is called wild cherry or black cherry. That bark is what I really want you to see, because that bark is super distinctive, and I've heard it described as like burnt potato chip bark. And the trees also, I found, if you look up this tree, it's not quite straight. It sort of has this little like wave to it. And I find that's not always true with black cherry or wild cherry, but it's often true that it sort of has a little bit of that shape to it. And sometimes I just spot them walking around from farther away because of that growth habit. But this tree, the branches are way up. And so even if we wanted to harvest them, we really would have a hard time doing so. But because I've seen this tree here and identified it, I know that it's likely that there might be some other trees of this species in the area that are younger and smaller. So in fact, that is the case. And we're going to look at one right here. Let's check out the bark so you can see how different it is on the younger version of this plant. So you're starting to see the cracking that will lead to that texture later. But a lot of the bark is very smooth, and it has this nice, I feel like the color is kind of distinctive, this like reddish undertone. And it has these little things, little bars on it called lenticels. I think those are just, they help the bark, the tree breathe. But some trees have them, so they can be used as an identifying trait. And then we'll look at the leaves. So this tree is Prunus serotina. That's the botanical name, in the Rosaceae or rose family. And it does have some traits that you'll see in other rose family plants, including that the flowers, which are not on here now, so unfortunately I can't show you, but the flowers have 5 petals and numerous stamens. Numerous in botany generally means 10 or more. And some other plants in the rose family include a lot of fruits that you know, so things like apple, as well as strawberry, and many more, but I won't get off into that because it's a big family, so there's a lot of things in there. And then the leaves of plants in the rose family often, but not always, have this sort of like oval-ish shape with a bit of serration. So this doesn't have a ton of serration, but you can see that the edge is lightly serrated or toothed. For this particular plant, one of the identifying traits that I use is that if we scratch the bark, then smell it. Oh, I love that smell. It's so good. So it's this sort of like almondy smell. And interestingly, that's actually due to the cyanide-related compounds in this plant that you may have heard, like apples also have some cyanide compounds, mostly in the seeds. But I love that smell. It can be toxic in large quantities, but the bark is used medicinally and is safe in the quantities that it's used in. So basically, oh no, I have my pruners. Perfect. So when we talk about harvesting from trees, we definitely can do damage to them if we're not careful. But if we learn proper pruning, then we can harvest close to where branches come off of somewhere else. So, you know, this branch is kind of in the way anyway. We needed to do some pruning here anyway, and we're going to make a cut close to the stem that this branched off of, so that it can heal pretty cleanly over and make the tree less prone to rot and decay. So yeah, so once let me show you one more plant, and then maybe we'll sit down and talk about some sort of practical details. Oh, there's some right there, the plant that I want to talk about. This is another plant that I learned as a kid. I love this plant. Some of you might recognize it. It's called plantain. So this plant is definitely edible, but I don't know, I feel like it just doesn't taste like that much. So it's nutritious. You could mix it in with other greens and various things. But I mostly use it medicinally. This is a great one for topical skin complaints. So everything from bug bite to stings to rashes, even to splinters. So it's good for irritations, but it also has a bit of a drawing action. So that's why I said like splinters and stings, it tends to draw things out. And even small infections, I think putting it on I've found that it helps to kind of pull the infection out, pull out the pus and stuff. So it can be used in a bunch of different forms. I think the best way to use it, and great to teach to kids, is the spit poultice. So you take a leaf. I'm not going to do it because I don't want to like chew and talk at the same time too much. I've already done that. But you're going to chew it up really well, keep it in your mouth. And then, you know, if I had like a bug bite on my foot that was really itchy, or a rash on my arm, once it's chewed up, or the alternative, if you don't want to chew it up, is kind of mush it up in your hands. And when you do that, you'll feel it gets like real like wet and kind of slippery. And so you want to get those good juices like right onto the rash or irritation. And then depending on like, you know, if you need to do something else on your foot or whatever, you could take another leaf, a clean leaf, and kind of put it on top and then secure it in place with something if you want. So you could leave it on there for a bit, which I find is more soothing. If you just put it on and then take it off, it soothes a little bit, but not as much as if you leave it on for a while. You can also leaf it on. Yeah. You can also extract, you can make like a plantain oil and use that for the same types of things, or make the oil into a salve by adding beeswax, and that's really one of my favorite salves, with or without other plants. Yeah, not my cherry. Let's pause and sit down and see what questions people might have. So, I don't know, Christina, if you want to unmute people or if people want to type into the chat box, either of those are fine. Doesn't anybody have any questions? I'll give you a couple minutes to think, or a minute or so to think about it. If not, we can move on.
I'm sorry, I was muted. There's a question from Becca. A question from Jess Barbini. What is black cherry used for?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So black cherry is great for cough, and sort of like wet coughs and phlegm, as well as sort of spasmodic coughs. So it has both an expectorant activity, which means it helps break up and dispel like mucus in the lungs, and it also like helps reduce coughing. It sort of relaxes. Yeah, it has like a relaxing effect. If you're sort of having a hard time stopping coughing, I find that wild cherry is very helpful for that. And the folks that I have given it to have found it very helpful, including someone I know who has asthma, who coughs a lot from that. And that's another use that I've heard for it. Although obviously, you know, if you have conventional medicine that you use for asthma, I'm not suggesting this as a substitute. But the way that I would process this is I would cut off like the smaller branches and leaves, and I cut a section to show it with. It helps if you have clean, sharp tools to do this with. And I would take a knife and peel off that bark. And what we're looking for is that nice colored inner bark. So when we start to get down to the like really light colored, drier stuff in the middle of the branch, that's not so medicinally active. And the outer part, this sort of darker part of the bark, is not so active either. So what we actually want is the stuff in the middle between those two that's sort of greenish or a little just like, I mean, even some of this like whitish stuff too that has a little hint of green to it and it's kind of moist. I use all of that. And then, you know, once I strip it off the stick, then I would cut it up into, probably not with the pruners, it's not the best tool. I would cut it up into small pieces like that. And then I would put those small pieces either to dry and I could use them in a tea, or I would make either a tincture or an infused honey out of them by putting them in a jar and covering them with either honey or alcohol, and use that to extract the medicinal properties. And then you would leave the plant matter in the honey or alcohol for several weeks. And then after a while, you would strain out the plant matter, you could compost it, and then you would take either the honey or the tincture, the alcohol tincture, when you're coughing, when you're feeling real phlegmy. So that's kind of how I would use that. And one of the, you know, this is a tree on our property that hasn't been pruned in a long time, so kind of needs to be pruned anyway. So that's a good way to harvest from the tree ethically. I would say if you're harvesting from property that's not yours, you know, you want to think about like just how are you going to make sure that the tree benefits or at least is not harmed by you taking a cut from it. And if it's in a public place, how do you know whether or not somebody else might be harvesting it from it? And so thinking about sort of the percentage that you're seeking and keeping that in mind. So that I think kind of brings us into like some ethical harvesting discussion. But were there any other questions about like what we've talked about so far? Any of the plants I've shown? Any plants that you saw in the background that you had questions about that I didn't say anything about, although I might not know them?
Would the dandelion help with like acid reflux or gastrointestinal esophageal reflux?
So the interesting thing with reflux is, so my understanding is that reflux can be both a result of too much acid, which is how we tend to think of it, right? Because you have this acid coming up your esophagus. But it also can be a result of not enough acid, because the stomach acid is what helps trigger that valve at the bottom of our esophagus to close properly. And so if we don't have enough stomach acid to trigger that, the acid that's there can still travel up the esophagus, even if there isn't an overproduction of it. So I would say that bitters, including dandelion, would help a lot more with the second type of reflux, right? That when there's not enough acid produced, because it can help to like trigger digestion and the release of those digestive juices, which could potentially help that valve to be functioning the way that it should be. If you are one of those people that has like excess acid, I don't necessarily know how much it would help, but it's not a super strong medicine. You know, it's not going to cause you to produce like 10 times the amount of stomach acid. It's going to have a mild effect. And so I think it is something that for most people, they could try out and see if it helps or not. The other piece is that I often, when I make bitters blends, which is how I like to use bitters medicinally if I'm not just eating the food, I mix the bitter herbs with warming carminative herbs. So carminative herbs are like warming and typically gas dispelling. So things like fennel and cardamom would fall into that category. And you can make a nice blend with the two. And so it sort of helps aid digestion in multiple ways at the same time. So hopefully that answered that question.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Are there any questions from the Facebook page, Jabril or Nikki? Seems like the Facebook does not have any comments right now, so continue.
That's fine. I think I'm going to sit here for a little bit and talk about some of the other details that we kind of skimmed over at the beginning. So a little bit more about ethical wild harvesting and good harvest practices and safety considerations. So I'll talk about those for a bit, and then I'll try to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end as well. So as I was saying with trees, obviously there's sort of some different considerations for harvest, but let me actually take a step back. So I think when people start getting into wild foods or herbal medicine, and I did this right here in this class, I think there's a lot of like, when we look at a plant, we're like, what is this plant good for? How can I use this plant? But I want to encourage all of you to think about how you can go beyond that. Because this, this cherry, this wild cherry tree, any of these plants here that we've looked at and talked about, these plants don't exist for me. These plants don't exist for you. They just exist. And we're not the only beings that might utilize them. Anything from pollinators to birds to other animals might utilize them in various ways. They provide the planet with various important services, for lack of a better word. Photosynthesis provides clean air. A lot of plants are filtering water. So there are all these other things that plants are doing beyond what just they're doing for us. And so I think part of ethical wild harvesting, Christina, can you mute people?
Yeah, I'm trying to see who's not muted.
Is it, unless it's you?
No.
Oh, okay.
I think that should fix it.
Okay. So I think just sort of thinking about like, not just what can plants do for us, but what can we do as well? How can we give back? And how can we be in reciprocity? How can we develop a relationship with plants and with the land around us? So I like to think about that, and I think that that's not something that we consider a lot in our culture. Obviously, that is something that a lot of indigenous cultures have more of a practice of or consideration of, including the indigenous peoples whose land, whose stolen land we are on right now, the Haudenosaunee, the Onondaga, depending on where you are, maybe other people as well. So without necessarily appropriating the practices of other people, I think we can still develop a relationship with the land that is reciprocal and a gratitude for it that isn't totally dependent on what can I get from it. That said, some of the plants we talked about, harvesting them is being in relationship with or giving back to the land in a certain way, because pulling out garlic mustard or Japanese knotweed can allow other plants to come in, and maybe we could help to spread the seed of other less common or native plants while we're doing that. We could do a little pruning when we see plants that are less common to help them grow. We could pick up some trash the next time that we're out harvesting wild plants. So there's a lot of different ways that I think we can be in reciprocity with plants and the land and to give back. And so I think just bringing a little bit of an aspect of that to your wild harvesting is a really good way to approach it. With trees, obviously, as I said, there are some practical considerations about making sure that the way that you harvest from them doesn't damage the tree. You definitely want to make sure that your tools, pruners, knife, whatever it is you're using, are clean, because you could spread diseases from one location to another if they're not clean, and sharp, because if they're dull, then again, you're increasing the chances, that the tree might get infected if it's not a clean cut. Other things we want to consider in terms of harvesting practices, not taking what could be invasive plant material or plant material that's infected with invasive pests to another location. So Japanese knotweed is known for regrowing from the tiniest bit of root or stem or whatever. So if you're going to harvest Japanese knotweed, you need to make sure that you either use all of it, or what you don't use, you either boil or dispose of in a way that makes sure that it's dead completely and can't regrow. Another example would be, we didn't look at it, but there's a hemlock tree on the other side of this property, and the hemlock woolly adelgid is a pest that affects the hemlock, and our hemlock tree has it. So if I cut branches off that tree, not looking at that, not being aware of that, and brought them to another location, I could be spreading that pest that has decimated hemlock trees in the southeastern U.S. and is starting to really negatively affect hemlock populations here as well. So in terms of ethical and safe wild harvesting, that is something to sort of learn more about. Also learning both the at-risk species in your area. United Plant Savers is a resource I mentioned in your handout that has a list of at-risk plants, and I would suggest that you start to learn some of those and make sure that you're not harvesting any of those, because those are ones that really can't sustain a bunch of people going out and harvesting from them. Other things, just general safety practices. So I'm out here in sandals and shorts. I am in an urban yard. I have not found ticks on myself in this yard, but I have found ticks on myself after being in other spots in the city of Binghamton. So part of safe wild harvesting is either wearing tick protective clothing, insect repellent, and or doing tick checks at the end of each day after you've been out and about. And certainly you can find more information about that online. And there's also another resource I mentioned in the handout called Tick Magic, which is a book that I like, sort of like a little booklet about dealing with ticks and maybe like reframing how we think about it. I think it's something that people, and rightly so, get really panicked about ticks and Lyme disease. And Lyme disease is very serious. But it's also, we don't all want to just be inside 100% of the time. And so I think we need to find ways to figure out how to balance those concerns and how to do so with the least amount of risk that we can. Also here, we're walking around in sandals, totally fine, not super brushy on our property. But if I'm going to other places, I usually wear long pants and shoes. We've been in the shade, but if I were in the sun, I was cautious to wear a shirt with sleeves. Obviously this time of year is big for sunburns when we get out and enjoy the sun early on and forget that our skin might still be sensitive if we're lighter skinned and prone to burning. But we should, so if we should all be careful about those various things. Legs can get scraped up, especially if we're going through like brambles, things like that. Okay, So let's talk about the safety considerations about the plants themselves. So in order to be safe when we're harvesting weeds, we need to do a few things. Number one, we need to make sure that we know what the plant is. If in doubt, do not consume it. Do not eat it. Do not use it medicinally. Do not feed it to your dog. Don't use it. So one of the ways that we can do that is, getting acquainted with plants for a while before starting to use them. Just practicing our identification skills, getting good guidebooks, using some of the websites I provided to start to learn the plants better. I usually recommend checking with at least 3 sources to make sure that it seems like it matches your identification. And then also, if possible, confirming your identification either in person or through photographs with somebody who does know the plant well. But I think some of these plants are plants that many of you already know, even if you haven't used them for food or medicine. So that's always a great place to start, right? If you already know what dandelion is, if you already know what Japanese knotweed looks like, those are great places to start and to do so safely. The other thing to keep in mind is that we are, or some of us may be harvesting from urban areas, whether that's gardens, yards, parks, just sort of marginal spaces, abandoned lots, things like that. I see great plants growing all over, but I don't necessarily want to harvest them, and they're not necessarily safe to harvest if they are near major roadways, near the foundation of houses, at least houses that are older, because they could be contaminated with lead from lead paint. Some people spray their yards, as well as some municipalities spray. Sometimes there can be great things growing under power lines, but power companies sometimes spray under those. So sort of being aware of whether there might have been spraying of herbicides or pesticides in the area where you're harvesting, and if so, then absolutely not harvesting from there. A big one to keep that in mind with is Japanese knotweed, because that is a really hard one to control, and that's often sprayed with pesticides or herbicides, and doesn't always die right away, so might continue growing even though it's been sprayed. And if you harvest that, that could be really unsafe. One area that definitely is sprayed a lot is along railroad tracks. It's a place that you sometimes see interesting things growing, but they are contaminated. Also, along sidewalks where people walk their dogs might not be the best place. And if you are sort of harvesting where you're not sure about like pet activity in the area, just being like very cautious about that and cleaning things well, and making sure to keep an eye out for it. Trying to think of any other general safety considerations. That should probably be most of it. And in terms of finding places to harvest, so I think obviously we're very privileged to have all this land here, but honestly, I can't harvest all these violet leaves or dandelions or whatever. So if you think about the people that you know with gardens or yards, if you don't have your own space to harvest, those can be like, especially if the things that you're harvesting or want to harvest are considered weeds, you might be able to strike a deal with a friend or neighbor that you will do some weeding for them in exchange for just keeping what you weed out, or even a farmer. So that's one way. Public spaces have different regulations related to whether they allow wild harvesting or not. Some like municipalities have different regulations. So I would encourage you to just kind of be aware and look into the regulations of the places that you want to harvest. Some places have like almost no regulations, whereas others, like the BU Nature Preserve, has like a pretty specific list of things that you can't do on that property. And I think if you're also using your best judgment if you're also using your best judgment about like how the things you harvest and activities you're engaging in are going to affect the land and environment. You know, I don't want to advocate illegal behavior, but I would say just, again, like use your best judgment about whether a place is appropriate to harvest. And also, even if it is a public space and you're allowed to harvest there, keeping in mind that the space is used by other people and you want to make sure that you leave enough for other people, other animals, other beings, pollinators, whatever. Okay. Oh, okay. Sorry. I apologize. My microphone moved while I was moving around. So yeah, and also I do want to acknowledge that there is, or there can be, a certain amount of privilege wrapped up or connected to like wild harvesting, especially urban foraging, that you know, if you are a person of color or an Indigenous person, that you could be negatively affected in ways that white folks perhaps aren't, when we, are doing things that could be considered weird or suspicious, like rummaging around and sort of cutting plants. So obviously, you know yourself and the risks that you are or are not willing to take. And I just want to acknowledge that and throw it out there as something that unfortunately needs to be kept in mind. I think that that's most of what I had about just sort of like finding places to harvest. We're nearing the end. I'm just going to mention a few things about preparing things that you've harvested, and then we can do some questions. So there's so many great ways that you can prepare wild edibles and wild medicinals. I think one really simple way that I love is to make like a seasonal vinegar. So basically like walking around and, putting a bit of this and a bit of that in a jar and then covering it with vinegar to make a flavored vinegar that then you can use as a seasoning when you're cooking. You can take spoonfuls of it medicinally. You can mix it into salad dressings or sauces or marinades. And it sort of has like the energy and the flavors of a season, which is really nice. So, if I walked around and did that now, it might have violet flowers and leaves. I might put in a bit of garlic mustard and dandelion. I think the one I made a little while ago had some spruce shoots. You could use like evergreen, young evergreen tips. So there's all kinds of things that you could throw in based on what's around, and that's just like a very simple way to get started with like preserving some flavors and drawing out some of the nutrients that are in those plants. Pestos are also super simple, and you can use a mix of both wild and cultivated greens and herbs, which is nice. So you can sort of choose stuff you might grow in your garden or that might be purchased with stuff that's wild, especially if the wild stuff has stronger flavors that you're still getting used to. So like garlic mustard can be very strong. Maybe you want to mix that with some spinach or some parsley, something like that. You could mix in some more mild wild herbs as well, like chickweed or cleavers, which are very common garden herbs that we don't really have here on this property much. So tiny bit of chickweed. But yeah, so there's lots of ways that you can do that. And you can find so many pesto recipes. Forget the pine nuts. Those are so expensive. You could use other nuts, or I like to use sunflower seeds in their place because they're cheaper and still have like that nice like nuttiness to them. And we like to freeze our pesto in like an ice cube tray, and then it's really easy to take out of the freezer and just like throw a cube or two into different dishes that you're making. And I've included some other recipes in your handout. I think one of the other ones that is pretty simple is like a simple syrup. So sugar, water, and then whatever herb or herbs you're trying to extract the flavor from. And that can be used medicinally, or it can be used as a really nice flavoring in like an iced tea or a mocktail or a cocktail. So that's fun as well. And just like adds a little more variety and flavor to your diet, as well as if you're using medicinal herbs, can add the medicinal benefits. So there's tons of recipes and resources for more recipes and tips on preservation, stuff like that in your handout. We have a couple minutes for questions, so if anybody has any, I'm happy to answer them. And please do remember, you have my email, so if you have any questions after the workshop, you can feel free to reach out.